Thank you for joining me this morning. I'm so happy to be here to celebrate Frankie Welch, and I'm so honored that the book received the Millia Davenport Publication Award, and that the CSA is meeting in Washington, D.C. Frankie's town is just too perfect. In 2022, the UGA Press with Georgia Humanities published the book Frankie Welch's Americana, Fashion, Scarves, and Politics, and the Hargret Rare Book and Manuscript Library at the University of Georgia presented an exhibition that I curated, and there's a virtual version of the exhibition on the Hargret's website. The photos I'll share today are from the collections of the Hargret, the Rome Area History Center, and Frankie's family. Mary Frances Frankie Barnett was born in Rome, Georgia in 1924, and Rome's in the northwestern part of the state. She was the youngest by far of 4 children, and in the photo on the left, she's with her sister, who is the next youngest. She demonstrated a skill for fashion and design at a young age. She graduated from high school in 1941, then went to Furman University in South Carolina, where she majored in clothing and design. She exhibited an entrepreneurial streak early on, and as a student, she set up a small business in her dorm room, helping, as she described them, the rich girls get dresses made for the various balls and parties. Her father, who worked for the telephone company, had saved enough money for tuition, but not for books and other fees, so she needed to earn some herself. After her junior year of college, she married her childhood sweetheart, Bill Welch, who was serving in World War II at the time. They lived briefly in Pensacola, Florida, where he was stationed, then for a short time in Rome, Georgia, where she taught home economics at the local high school. She also took summer courses at the University of Georgia in Athens to earn her teacher certification requirements. They returned to Furman in 1947, and Frankie graduated in 1948 and Bill in 1950. They then moved to Madison, Wisconsin for Bill to pursue his master's degree in American history. Frankie both took and taught sewing classes there. She also greatly admired the architect Frank Lloyd Wright, to the point that she knew when he went to the bank, so she would park her car at a nearby corner and sit and sketch what he was wearing because she thought he dressed so perfectly for his size and image. In 1952, the family, which now included the first of 2 daughters, Peggy, moved to Alexandria, Virginia for Bill Welch to work with the federal government. Frankie soon started teaching various classes and seminars on fashion, sewing, and home economics, often focusing on how to coordinate a wardrobe. She also did private consulting, and she was confidential about her work, not revealing the names of her clients, which helped her develop an impressive and devoted network of prominent women in the DC area. When she began her career, most of those women were the wives of politicians and diplomats and government leaders, rather than elected or appointed officials themselves. Nonetheless, they were often in the media spotlight, so their fashion choices were important. And Frankie helped them with all aspects of their appearance, even advising women on the best way to hold a purse when being photographed. Soon, Frankie realized that traveling to multiple destinations to put together a coordinated wardrobe for her client was not compatible with her young family's schedule. So in 1963, she opened her own shop where all of the elements of a wardrobe could be provided in one place. She and her husband purchased a historic building known as Duval House in Old Town Alexandria, which was not quite yet the popular destination that it is now. For the first years, the family lived upstairs and Frankie had the shop downstairs. The shop, called Frankie Welch of Virginia, was immediately successful, and it became not only a place to shop, but also an important social hub. She maintained a busy schedule of activities there with trunk shows and book signings, so it really was a place to be. And she sold clothes primarily by American designers in a middle price range, including Oscar de la Renta, Jeffrey Bean, Adele Simpson, Vera Maxwell, and Molly Parnis. She also sold some of her own designs, especially this dress, which she called the Frankie. It's a fairly simple design, loosely based on a kimono, and she created it initially as a tool for teaching students about various historic waistlines, so you could tie an empire waist or a natural waist or do a crisscross effect. And the fact that it could be tied different ways was one of its appealing qualities when she marketed it. It could also be made in different fabrics, with different patterns, and sometimes with different trims. And one reporter noted that this was the dress that had been to more White House dinners than any other, and that women wearing Frankies didn't mind running into each other at events because each Frankie looked different. So even though it's a one-size-fits-all design, there's a lot of variety because of the way the different fabrics drape and the way the different patterns look, the different ways you can tie it, and the different bodies that it would be on. One of the women who frequented the shop was Virginia Rusk, whose husband, Dean Rusk, was Secretary of State from 1961 to 1969, and he was also from Georgia. On one visit, Virginia told Frankie that the State Department and White House needed a new something that they could give as gifts, and she said that it should be something truly American. So Frankie, aware of the current vogue for signature scarves, and those are scarves with a designer's name featured prominently, decided to make a signature scarf with the Cherokee alphabet, and this was in 1967. She had seen the alphabet, which is actually a syllabary rather than an alphabet with the characters representing syllables rather than phonemes, in an old book of her father's on the history of Rome and Floyd County, Georgia, during a recent visit to her hometown. And she considered the Cherokee alphabet to be truly American and to represent her home state and Dean Rusk's home state. According to family oral history, she also believed that she was part Cherokee, so this, for her, honored her ancestors as well. Current genealogical research does not support this familial Cherokee connection, but that is what she was told and what she believed for her entire life and what the media enjoyed reporting. And I'll come back to that. The scarf was well received, and the State Department and White House did use it as gifts, which is an impressive debut for a scarf designer. And even with this first scarf, she recognized the possibilities and importance of making the scarf's introduction into an event. That would get media attention, and it would make the women who received the scarves feel that they, both the women and the scarves, were even more special. She had a fashion show in Alexandria to introduce this scarf, and it was modeled by many prominent women, one of whom was the wife of the House Minority Leader and her good friend, Betty Ford. Fashion designer Norma Norell also made a skirt from yardage of the scarf material, which you see on the right. And this scarf remained her bestseller throughout her career, and she had it reprinted more than 40 times in a variety of colorways and on different fabrics. She also used the design on ties and tote bags, and she used yardage to make outfits like these pantsuits. A friend of Frankie's, LaDonna Harris, who was and is a prominent Native American rights activist and a member of the Comanche Nation, wore one of these pantsuits when she and her husband, who is a congressman from Oklahoma, went on the Dick Cavett show, and it looked amazing. Miss Harris liked wearing the Cherokee alphabet design because it was a conversation starter, and it helped her talk to people about Native American rights. And I'm really honored that Miss Harris wrote the preface for the Frankie book. Frankie's second scarf in early 1968 was also a high-profile affair. A couple of the women who worked for Lady Bird Johnson, the first lady at the time, were frequent visitors to Frankie's shop, and they were Bess Abel and Liz Carpenter. And Lady Bird is in the white dress on the photo on the right, and that's a dress she bought at Frankie's shop. And through Abel and Carpenter, Frankie ended up designing a scarf for the first and only fashion show to take place at the White House. The show had the theme of Discover America in Style, and it featured American designers, and the backdrop for the runway showed a projection of famous sites across the country, and the Navy Band played. It was a big patriotic affair, and it was attended by the wives of the governors. There was only one female governor at the time, and she was unable to attend. There were also some designers and other VIPs there. For her scarf, Frankie used the words Discover America over an abstract shape of the continental US in red, white, and blue, kind of suggesting a travel poster. And the scarves featured prominently on the runway, and all of the attendees received one as a gift. And they actually received temporary scarves, then were sent professionally manufactured scarves in the mail later. This fashion show came together very quickly, and Frankie didn't have time to have the scarves professionally printed, so she and the White House drafted volunteers to go to her shop to hand paint and hand screen print and hem these initial scarves. I also want to recommend Kimberly Crispin Campbell's book, Red, White, and Blue on the Runway, that is all about this fashion show. And it was fun to have these books in progress at the same time because we were able to share really detailed information with each other. After the fashion show for Lady Bird Johnson, who was a Democrat, Betty Ford asked Frankie for equal time for the Republicans, and they decided that she would design a documentary fabric around the theme Fresh as a Daisy, rather than using the traditional elephant motif. So she created this documentary daisy print, and it was used to make dresses for hostesses to wear at the Republican National Convention in Miami that year. Then she designed hostess dresses and a scarf for supporters of Vice President Hubert H. Humphrey, who also ran for president in 1968, and he was a Democrat. For these dresses, which she called H-line dresses, so a play on the popular A-line silhouette, she wanted them to be both highly visible in photographs and on television, which they were, and she wanted them to be fashionable beyond the novelty of this one election season. And that they were appreciated as stylish is especially well conveyed by one story in particular. Betty Ford was at Frankie's shop selecting outfits to wear to the Republican National Convention, and she reported in her autobiography, quote, once Frankie came into her shop, caught me parading around in a dress I thought was really pretty, and hooted, "Take that off! You don't want that, Betty. It was designed for Hubert Humphrey's campaign workers." Sure enough, the decorative stripes down the sides and the band across the waist formed a very nice capital H, end quote. So she didn't end up purchasing it after all. The Humphrey scarf, you'll notice, has a reserve in the lower right corner for his signature. And for most designers, the only important signature on a signature scarf was their own, but Frankie often used signatures in other ways, including reserves like this, either pre-printed with the famous person's name or blank so that the scarf's owner could have it signed, or she incorporated signatures into the overall design. This early scarf is unusual in that her name is only in the selvage or on the tag sewn on the back, and after this, she always had her name or initials on the scarves. She was really excellent at branding. Richard Nixon was the winner of the 1968 election, and Frankie designed scarves for him that were given out at his inaugural ball. And the media certainly noted Frankie's ability to be bipartisan, and she believed that was an important key to a successful business. And she liked to be able to say that Democrats and Republicans shopped side by side in her shop. After the amazing success Frankie experienced during the 1968 election, especially the order of the Humphrey scarves, and with the extensive media attention, she decided to expand her scarf business. She put together a brochure about her scarf designs and sent it to 5,000 American businesses, telling them that she could make them a scarf that was fashionable and personalized and meaningful. And much of her scarf production was focused on limited edition custom scarves that businesses or individuals or churches or schools or museums or various associations could commission. Some of these were souvenirs at events, swag at conferences, gifts to patrons, or they were used as fundraisers or incentives or with uniforms. She could work out a way for anyone to want and need a scarf, and she loved selling them. She designed likely thousands of scarves from the late 1960s through the 1990s, but there is no master list, so I'm not exactly sure how many she did. Generally, though, she offered clients the option of packaging their scarves in individual Frankie Welch envelopes, which could also hold promotional material for the client, as well as information about Welch herself or flyers about the many, many ways to tie your scarf. In 1970, Frankie introduced her 50 State Flowers scarf. It debuted on May Day at the National Cathedral during the annual Flower Mart for the Garden Clubs of America, and it received national media attention. For this one, she took inspiration from the White House china, which has state flowers on the dessert plates that Lady Bird Johnson had ordered from Tiffany's. And Frankie put most of the state flowers in clusters around the edge of her scarf, but she selected one to go in the center alone, Georgia's state flower, the Cherokee rose. And again, she used yardage of the scarf design to make garments like this beautiful dress and the shirtwaist dress for Betty Ford, which you see on the left. And that is what she wore when she first stepped out of her Alexandria home to greet reporters after Nixon announced his impending resignation. So this is what Betty Ford wore when she learned that she would soon be First Lady. And it's kind of a brilliant choice. It was by an American designer, and it had a connection to the White House through the china, and it represented all of the states. And Betty Ford wore a lot of Frankie's scarves and garments from Frankie's shop during her time in the White House, which was 74 to 77. And her presence there really heightened Frankie's national reputation. And Frankie was often described as the fashion advisor to the First Lady. She also designed a custom scarf with Betty Ford in 1975. It features polka dots, which Betty liked, petunias, which were her favorite flower, her signature, and colors that matched her favorite turtleneck shirts. And they had a press conference at the White House to introduce it. And when Betty Ford was asked to donate something to the First Lady's collection at the Smithsonian, she of course didn't have a fancy inaugural dress, so she selected one of her favorite dresses by Frankie, which you see on the right, and she only agreed to donate it after Frankie agreed to make her a copy of it. Frankie, first and foremost with her designs, wanted to be fashionable, so you can trace the history of scarf fashion during these decades through her scarves. Her earliest ones were primarily large squares in silk or cotton, and as we get into the early 1970s, she moved to the smaller size and introduced her distinctive 8 by 8 inch module designs, which was an inspiration from Frank Lloyd Wright, who liked to use modules in his architecture. She usually made scarves of 1 by 4 modules, as you see here, but occasionally she made 3 by 3 module scarves or 4 by 4, and she printed yardage to make Frankie's. She also hemmed single modules and called them napkerchiefs, a portmanteau of napkin and handkerchief. And often in the 1970s and the first half of the 80s, her scarves were made of the popular synthetic materials of the era. So you see a lot that are polyester or triacetate, and one she particularly favored, Kiana, which is a silky nylon from DuPont. And this was one of the earliest module scarves. It came about after one of her friends from Rome was in DC lobbying for support of libraries. And the friend wasn't having much luck and decided that what her group really needed was a Frankie Welch scarf. So she convinced the Georgia Libraries Association to commission these scarves, which were introduced at a conference on Jekyll Island in 1971. And they asked Frankie to recognize Georgia subtly in the design, so she included the Library of Congress and Dewey Decimal call numbers for books on Georgia. And on the right is her daughter Jeannie modeling a scarf. Partly because of the success of her Cherokee alphabet design, Frankie introduced other Native American-inspired designs, including this one of turtles from 1971. And the turtle motif is based on an image she saw on a piece of early pottery in Arizona. I do want to acknowledge that Frankie's Native American-inspired designs now can be understood as cultural appropriation, but I believe that Frankie handled it about as well as she could have at the time. She genuinely believed that she was part Cherokee. She worked with LaDonna Harris, who, as I mentioned before, is a member of the Comanche Nation, to get a clean copy of the syllabary to use when making the original Cherokee alphabet scarf, and she donated a percentage of each sale of that scarf to a fund supporting education for members of the Cherokee Nation. Her intent was to raise awareness of the Cherokee, and she did. In 1998, at an event honoring Frankie's 30th anniversary in design, Helen Thomas, the famous White House correspondent, stated that Frankie was the one person in the Washington area to, quote, raise our threshold of understanding about the Native Americans, especially the Cherokees, end quote. Frankie's designs were part of a larger vogue for Native American-inspired designs. So if you think of hippie clothing with leather and fringe and feather and beads, that's another expression of the same style or impulse. So again, Frankie was being fashionable. And as with many of her designs, she produced turtles as a scarf, and she printed yardage to make garments, especially Frankie's. She also made little Frankies for children. And during the exhibition opening at the Hargret, a couple of her great-granddaughters came wearing her little Frankies, which was really special. In 1973, Frankie introduced a group of 4 more Native American-inspired designs that she promoted with Goldwater's department store in Arizona. And one of those was based on Cherokee basket patterns. And she used one of those designs on the cover of a book she wrote titled Indian Jewelry, which is about how to wear and collect and display Native American jewelry. These Native American-inspired designs also fit into the theme of Americana for Frankie and her peers. And though always somewhat nebulous in meaning, in the 60s and 70s, the term Americana generally suggested early American antiques, folk art, colonial revival designs, or simply anything in a red, white, and blue color scheme. In fashion, it could mean inspiration from the military, the trappers of the frontier era, Native Americans, or iconic pastimes like baseball. And the term typically indicated patriotism and nostalgia, and it's a term that Frankie herself used to promote her designs. And while the term Americana encompasses nearly all of Frankie's scarves, including ones related to politics and branding, it was most closely linked to her Native American influenced designs and her creations for the U.S. Bicentennial. She designed numerous scarves for the 200th anniversary of the United States in 1976, including this one celebrating the original 13 states. The design was based on a souvenir button from George Washington's inauguration that I believe she had seen at the Smithsonian. Most of her bicentennial scarves were officially part of the American Revolution Bicentennial Administration, ARBA, which was a group created by Congress in 1973 to kind of organize and promote the bicentennial events. And these scarves included 5 that celebrated presidents and were based on historic textiles. And these bicentennial scarves were really popular, and she produced a lot of them, and they sold well, which she liked a lot. She also enjoyed their celebration of American history and American presidents. George Washington had visited the building where she had her shop, both when it was a tavern and when it was a bank, so this history was closely tied to her business and her image. And I've already talked about her connections to the Johnson White House and the Ford White House, but Frankie was a Georgia girl, so of course she had connections to the Carter White House. Her link to the Carters predated their time in Washington. She designed this scarf in 1973 while Jimmy Carter was governor of Georgia. Rosalind had initially asked for a quilt-themed scarf, but so had the First Lady of Virginia, Catherine Godwin, and Mrs. Godwin got the quilt scarf, and the Carters ended up with this amazing peanut design because of Jimmy Carter's family business. And they used the scarves as gifts at the governor's mansion in Atlanta. And the first scarves were printed on silk, and then because it was so popular, they had a second round printed on cotton. Frankie also printed some yardage to use to make a Frankie. And I think this dress just has it all. It's by an American designer, it's by a woman, it's by someone from Georgia, it's got a connection to the Carters, it's got peanuts. It's really Americana fashion at its best. And because the first peanut scarf was so successful, when she was asked to design a scarf for Jimmy Carter's presidential campaign in 1976, she returned to peanuts. and that's Frankie's son-in-law, Paige Williams, modeling the peanut tie and pocket square. And Frankie continued creating political designs throughout her career, including numerous ones for presidential inaugurations, like these. On the left is a silk Napa chief from 1985 for Ronald Reagan's second inauguration, and she called that design the Reagan plaid. And on the right, it's a cotton bandana from Bill Clinton's first inauguration in 1993, depicting the bus trip from Charlottesville to D.C., and it was given to guests at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel and displayed at the Blue Jean Ball. And I'm going to continue now with some DC-specific scarves so that you can think about Frankie as you're out and about enjoying the district, and maybe consider what would have caught her eye as a good scarf motif or what it would have meant to see women walking around wearing her scarves. And this scarf, probably from 1978, obviously is of DC, but it's not a typical perspective. As the story goes, this depicts the view from Max Cleland's office in the Veterans Administration building. And Max Cleland was also a Georgian, and he had a long career in politics, including as head of the VA from 1977 to 81. And Frankie's husband, who died in 1975, spent much of his career directing the Veterans Administration Congressional Liaison Service, and Frankie was friends with Cleland, so she was quite familiar with this building and this view. And this is one of the scarves that she produced again on a larger scale and sold in her shop and through select department stores. She also adapted this design to other scarves and totes for specific clients. This early scarf celebrates the 1970 National Cherry Blossom Festival. It's a great modern design, and it documents the event by including the name and date and location. And Frankie designed the scarf for the Cherry Blossom Ball Committee, and it was sold by the DC Junior Chamber of Commerce. And she liked this design and redid it in red and teal and used scarves with that color pairing to make the garment on the right. This is the Member of Congress scarf, and it's another design that she produced in larger quantities, and shoppers could find it in gift shops on Capitol Hill. So you could go to the gift shop and purchase a scarf and then take it to your favorite member of Congress to have it signed. And this early one on the left is from 1969, and Frankie had it signed by 7 members of Congress from Georgia. And on the right, you see that she had reissued this design as a module scarf around 1975. This is the U.S. Senate scarf. So the U.S. Senate celebrated its bicentenary in 1989, and though it began planning for that event in 1983. So sometime during that period, Frankie designed this scarf, and she filled it with meaningful architectural details, primarily from the old Senate chamber. And a flyer that accompanied the scarves explains the symbols Frankie used. And it reads, "Centered on the square block design is a shield suggested by the escutcheon suspended above the vice president's desk in the old Senate chamber. It's decorated with 13 stars and 13 stripes, denoting the original 13 states. Directly below is a small hourglass form, which represents the ivory gavel used in the Senate since its earliest days." And it goes on, "The principal emblem, surrounded by the words United States Senate, rests on a field of 16 stars. This background was adapted from the star carpet in the old Senate chamber. The selection of 16 stars symbolizes the number of states in the Union in 1800 when the Senate first moved into the Capitol building." And a little more. "Radiating from the center field are 4 columns whose tobacco and corncob capitals reflect architect Benjamin Latrobe's early 19th century designs for the original Senate wing." And these black and white photographs were in Frankie's reference file for this scarf, so you can see very directly where she was getting her design inspirations. And these are 2 scarves Frankie designed for the National Press Club, the left one in 1973 and the right one in 1977. I think they really reflect the changing role for women in America in the early 1970s. So the National Press Club was founded in Washington in 1908 and began presenting speakers with neckties in 1966, several years before it opened its membership to women in 1971. And when U.S. Representative Bella Abzug from New York received a tie after speaking at a press club luncheon in 1971, she said, "I'll give it to my husband and tell him it came from a chauvinistic organization." And when Gloria Steinem received a tie after speaking, she sardonically responded, "Well, I suppose I could put it on and get a jacket and confirm everybody's worst suspicions, right?" Clearly, the group needed an appropriate gift for women, so it turned to Frankie for a scarf. And they used these as the gift for women speakers until the 1980s when they began giving out gender-neutral mugs to speakers. And with these 2 scarves, you can see Frankie again keeping with current trends. So the earlier one is bold with a large version of the group's logo, while the later one depicts the symbols enveloped in a pretty leafy design. And many of her scarves in the late 70s and into the 80s include small floral detail designs like this or detailed architectural elements like this. So this is a Napa chief of her design for the Red Cross, and it was made in 1980 in preparation for the Red Cross's centennial in 1981, and it was inspired by architectural details from the Red Cross's headquarters building in Washington, D.C. And again, this black and white photo was in her reference file for this scarf, so you can see where she got her inspiration. This is a scarf for the Alexandria Junior Women's Club's annual embassy tour from 1977, and the promotional flyer reads, "The design of the embassy tour scarf consists of identical modules. Each contains the facsimiles of embassies, with trees so typical of Northwest Washington." So women could wear Frankie's scarves to show their political affiliations, or their support of various institutions, or involvement with different academic or social groups. Often, putting on a Frankie scarf was, and still is, about more than finding a pretty pattern and colors that look nice. It's a statement of your interests and affiliations. And here are a couple of Smithsonian designs. On the left is one for the National Museum of History and Technology, which is now the National Museum of American History, from 1973, showing highlights from that collection. It's one of the few that isn't a module design, but it's the same size as a 1x4 module scarf. And on the right is one for Air and Space from 1976, and it's got the blocky forms of the building and the pinwheel effect to kind of suggest motion, and then that swirling line around the plane suggests light. And you can see the proposal down at the bottom. And she ended up doing different colors from the proposal, and she moved her name, but this proposal is pretty typical of what she would work up for clients. Generally, Frankie did the preliminary designs in close coordination with her clients, and then she hired artists to prepare the designs to be transferred to screen prints, and all of her scarves are screen printed. And I keep thinking that I have enough Frankie scarves, and I look back at ones like these, and I think that perhaps I need a few more. Frankie designed this scarf for the American Cancer Society in 1981, and the photograph shows her at an American Cancer Society event at Tyson's Corner Marriott Hotel with Elizabeth Taylor and Barbara Bush. Again, she was making an event of the scarf, and she knew Taylor from the Watergate. After Frankie's husband died, she moved to that fashionable location where Taylor's sixth husband, Senator John Warner of Virginia, also lived, and she had designed a couple of custom tote bags for Elizabeth Taylor. And I just love this visual documentation that a woman from the not huge town of Rome, Georgia, ended up in D.C. hanging out with First Ladies and Elizabeth Taylor, all from her scarves and dress shop. In the mid-80s, Frankie returned to mostly large silk square scarves and some cotton bandanas. And the scarf on the left was for the U.S. Naval Academy's 30th reunion of the class of 1960, and on the right is a bandana for the bank BB&T. Frankie's shop in Alexandria closed in 1990, and she stopped designing scarves around 1999. She was beginning to experience dementia, and she retired to Charlottesville, Virginia, near one of her daughters in 2001, and she died in September of 2021. I'm really grateful to have had the opportunity to help share Frankie's story. Like Frankie, I'm from Northwest Georgia, and I spent time in DC when I was in grad school, and I have connections to Athens. So I'm especially proud of her accomplishments as a woman from Georgia with an interest in textiles and fashion. Her family has been absolutely delightful and so supportive, and I appreciate all the help I've received from friends and colleagues in the various archives where I've conducted research, and the enthusiasm sent my way from people as they share their stories of Frankie and their excitement as they first learn about her. Frankie Welch occupies an interesting place in American history. Some people remember her vividly, and for them, everyone knew who Frankie was. For a lot of people, though, especially younger people, she's a new name. But as a female entrepreneur and a Southern designer, she really was remarkable. She created and followed her own career path to great financial achievements and media acclaim and fashion success. Her scarves provide a material history of our country, at least for her circle, during the last several decades of the 20th century. And they're great examples of Americana fashion. I've just shared a few today, but each of the hundreds, if not thousands of her scarves is a window into American history and culture. Each one tells a story. Thank you.